Racism in the United States has damaged America's image abroad for decades, but this is the first time that the President and members of his administration, notably the Secretary of State, have ignored or dismissed its impact on the country's influence abroad.
Since the 1940s, the United States critics have seized upon manifestations of racism and inequality in America to discredit the narrative of the superiority of democracy over other systems, such as communism and authoritarianism. Racist violence, from unjust arrests and brutal killings to the targeting of 9 black teenagers exercising their civil right to attend Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, formed staples of Soviet propaganda against the U.S.
Criticism from China is also nothing new. In 1948, a Shanghai paper, Ta Kung Pao, opined, if the United States merely wants to dominate the world, the atomic bomb and the U.S. dollar will be sufficient to achieve that purpose. If the United States wants to lead the world, it must have a kind of moral superiority in addition to military superiority.
In his failure to understand the difference between dominating and leading, Donald Trump has decimated America's standing in the world, and with it, the capacity to inspire by example.
During the Cold War, presidents from Harry Truman to Lyndon Johnson, and their secretaries of state recognized the connection between national security and domestic policy, between the power of America's influence in the world and the narrative of race at home. This recognition played a role in the passage of the historic civil rights legislation of the 1950s and 1960s. American leaders learned that manipulating the narrative was insufficient, they had to demonstrate positive action.
Today's protests against the continued injustices of racism in the U.S. reveal the limitations of the legislation and Supreme Court decisions of the last century. The legal equality they provided did little to eliminate systemic racism and economic inequality, what MacArthur scholar Saidiya Hartman calls the afterlife of slavery.
The protesters' pleas for justice and President Trump's and Attorney General Barr's brutal, militarized response are reminiscent of the kinds of authoritarian crackdowns the U.S. usually denounced. The awful response echoes the Egyptian military in Tahrir Square or the Chinese in Tiananmen Square.
The video of George Floyd's death and the scenes of peaceful protesters attacked by police provide Iran, China, and Russia ammunition in the form of blatant hypocrisy that kneecaps the United States' ability to advocate for human rights.
All three countries have decried the use of force against peaceful marchers on American streets. The Chinese have deftly deflected criticism of the crackdown in Hong Kong, first with a tweet, "I can't breathe," and then with a longer question from Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian, why does the U.S. side criticize Hong Kong police's civilized and restrained law enforcement while it threatens to fire guns at domestic protesters and even deploy the U.S. National Guard to suppress them?
Unlike his predecessors, Trump and his allies in the Congress such as Mitch McConnell do not understand that dissent in general, and about race in particular, is a patriotic American act.
At the height of segregation in the 1950s and early 1960s, the U.S. government sent African American jazz ambassadors around the world to trumpet the sounds of freedom. The irony of black artists representing American freedom and democracy when they often were not even permitted to enter the front doors of performance venues in the U.S. was lost on no one. Dizzy Gillespie declined a pre-tour briefing, and declared his intention to speak openly, if asked, about race in America. "I've had 300 years of briefing. I know what they've done to us. I sort of liked the idea of representing America, but I wasn't going over there to apologize for the racist policies of America," he said. The State Department sent Dizzy Gillespie and his band anyway, to tour Africa, the Middle East, and behind the Iron Curtain, and to speak, when asked, about race in his home country. As Senator William J. Fulbright stated at the height of the Vietnam protests, "To criticize one's country is to do it a service and pay it a compliment. It is a service because it may spur the country to do better than it is doing. It is a compliment because it evidences a belief that the country can do better than it is doing. Criticism, in short, is more than a right, it is an act of patriotism, a higher form of patriotism."
What Trump and his supporters fail to grasp is that precisely this quality of self-criticism and striving to do better has, or, more realistically, had earned the United States the admiration of people around the world, particularly those in autocratic countries where dissent was forbidden.
Cultural envoys who spoke out against racist policies, or the Vietnam War, provided living proof of the freedoms of the democratic system the United States proclaimed as superior to communism. This humility and willingness to admit vulnerabilities and mistakes takes precisely the opposite tack from the boastful, MAGA posture of Donald Trump, but it works much better.
How will the United States be judged? By the bombast of a cowardly narcissist with no understanding of what America stands for, or by the increasing crescendo of voices, from the streets and from the halls of government who oppose him?
A group of Pakistani students in Lahore once greeted me this way: when we say we hate America, we never mean the people. Is that how the world will assess the United States, focusing on the protesters and the leaders who support them, rather than the Trump administration and the Republican Party?
The Cold War history suggests that if the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Philando Castile, Ahmaud Arbery, Eric Garner and so many others prompt real change in laws, the justice system, and policing in the U.S., the United States will be able, over time, to regain a global standing of respect and admiration.
If not, the light of Reagan's beacon on the hill will remain dark.
Cynthia Schneider is a distinguished professor in the practice of diplomacy at Georgetown University. She teaches, publishes, and organizes initiatives in the area of diplomacy and culture.